Hi, and welcome back to the Technology Policy Institute's podcast, To Think Minimum. Today is Wednesday, September 24th, 2019. I'm Scott Walston, TPI President and Senior Fellow. I'm joined by Judith Mariscal, who is professor at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, CIDE, and executive director of the Cyber Policy Center for Latin America. She's a leading telecommunications scholar and easily the most knowledgeable and thoughtful person on telecom in Mexico. We're thrilled that she's spending a little bit of time with us now as a TPI visiting scholar, and also happy that she's sitting down for this podcast today. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you.
So for the last few years, we've seen lots of big changes in not just in politics in Mexico, but in the telecommunications sector. And one of the biggest issues that possibly has broader lessons for the rest of the world is the story of Red Compartida, the wholesale network, where the government provided a 90 megahertz block of the 700 megahertz spectrum band and awarded build-out to a company. It's been hugely controversial. So tell us a little bit about how that came to be and what its status is today, and its purposes and so on.
Okay, well, that was it was mandated by the Constitution, and that was part of the 2013 reform in telecommunication. The reform in itself had basically two objectives. One was to diminish concentration, market concentration, so discipline the incumbents in telecom services, also in media services.
And the incumbents were who at the time?
The incumbents were, basically mobile and fixed. It's Telmex, Telmex and América Móvil. It's owned by Carlos Slim. And then in media is Televisa. So both of them have market shares close to 87% of the market in each segment of the market.
So the government went into this with a very concentrated market.
Exactly. And you could look at it as a new take at what the first reform, the 1990 reform, did not accomplish. So it was like pending issues that after 20 years of different regulatory policies, they had not been able to tackle. Both the lack of competition in the market, and the other one is the infrastructure deficit and the digital divide, the inequalities within the country. So having those two objectives in mind, the competition issues were addressed through asymmetrical policies and the infrastructure deficit through a mandate of creating two wholesale networks. One of them was the Red Compartida. So that's where it comes from. And what you actually have written in the Constitution are very specific.
Wait, before you move on and talking about the Red Compartida, you said there were two. What's the other?
The other one is called Red Troncal. The names are kind of random. Wow. The Red Compartida is mobile, is broadband, and the Red Troncal is fixed broadband. As you mentioned, Red Compartida uses the totality of the 700 bandwidth, which in and of itself is interesting. It's the only country, for example, in Latin America to not have auctioned that spectrum to the market. Other countries, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, actually got quite a lot of money from the spectrum. And more importantly, the market got spectrum and inputs to invest. So the totality of it was given to this company that it's a public-private partnership. The government puts in the spectrum plus additional soft loans. So they carried on.
So the companies actually had to bid. They put out a request for proposals, right?
Yes. And there was very little interest. First of all, it's a wholesale network. Both of them are.
Meaning
that their only customers are MVNOs.
So they don't sell directly to consumers. They sell to companies who then sell to consumers.
Yes. And during this construction and the design of the...
So one actually, sorry to interrupt, but an interesting little side note is one of the companies that bid for it was Rivada Networks, which is a company that also here has tried to get hold of free spectrum in order to provide a wholesale network with the help of political insiders, and so far has failed, like they did in Mexico.
Well, even more interesting is the fact that Rivada also is someone that works for them is called Juan Lutlo, and I'm being pretty open here about it. Mm-hmm. Juan Lutlo was the key person in deciding the wholesale, the Red Compartida, because he was working for the Ministry of Communications at the time of the reform. He was an advisor to the minister, and he lobbied very strongly for the design, the specific design of the Red Compartida. And when he left the government and then worked for Rivada and was the bidder.
Huh.
So you think there was conflict,
they didn't win,
but they didn't win. But you think there was a conflict of interest.
You think, yeah.
But anyway, they didn't win. They didn't win because again, very, very strange stories, but they just did not come. The day they had to come with the sealed envelope that had a guarantee, they didn't take the guarantee with them. It's like you want to go get your license. Yes.
Wow.
They really weren't interested? I don't know. How do you forget that part,
Yeah, that's...
But they sued the government, and they're still pending.
Oh, the suit is still active?
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Uh-huh. And they're pretty, anything that they're looking at all the time and say, look, they didn't do this and that.
So Rivada didn't get the network, and then a different company did.
Exactly. Altan got the network, and then when you look at the funding, the law mandates this is be a public-private partnership, a PPP, and there were safeguards that were good, that, reasonable, like this was supposed to be mutually competitive, in competition. They couldn't be favored, in terms of regulation because it had public funding or public participation.
So it was supposed to be treated like, from the government's perspective, it was supposed to be treated like all the other networks.
Exactly. It couldn't be favored.
Except for the specific rules that it operated under.
Right.
Also.
But also, in the end, which was something that was not expected, was that the funding did not come from Altan, the company, the company. It came from the World Bank, IFD, from the Chinese also fund at the World Bank. It came from different companies. They have Huawei,
Huawei's an investor?
Well, not through the Chinese fund.
But I mean by themselves?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. I don't recall all of the partners, but I can share that with you of how much. Also a Mexican Development Bank. So it's not only the spectrum, it's also the Mexican Development Bank putting in funding, all this to pay for winning the...
It was supposed to be a private company winning the competition and building the network. But instead, it ended up being mostly a consortium of international development organizations.
And Mexican Development Bank.
And the Mexican Development, which is the same thing, except it's not international, right?
It's the same thing. Yeah. So private, not really private. Actually, Altan put zero.
Interesting.
Money. And they're managing all these different funds. And why? Well, this is just a hypothesis, but it's clearly one of the obligations that the Red Compartida had to fulfill was to take the network, deploy network to 98% of the population. And in the process of the bidding, designing the bidding process, they took it down to 86. They realized it was just not a good business model. It was not sustainable.
86%
of the population.
86% of the total population.
They're not, but by 2026, 4G by 2026.
And does that mean, so the remaining 14%, are they allowed to exclude the same populations that are already excluded? Or, what 14% of the population do they not have to serve?
Oh, it's just what they decide.
But, okay.
As a whole, they had to serve originally 98 of whatever,
right.
And then it went down to 86 of whatever.
Okay.
Except it also included magical towns.
Right, I saw that. What exactly is a magical town?
It's a tourist. It's basically they give it so they can get more tourists. So it's like has a history, a heritage.
Oh, so they see it as an economic development tool, maybe.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Exactly. When you look at why it's not sustainable, and that's that part of the problem. Besides the first issue that has the opportunity cost of the use of the spectrum, then the next thing is, okay, will this work? Even if, okay, so you don't have the spectrum in the market, but this is really going to take, do the trick of getting places where there's no service, and get it to places like, hospitals and schools, and you're not expecting it to get to homes. The problem is that there's just not enough MVNOs in Mexico. That's why the model is it's not a good business model.
Why didn't it attract new MVNOs?
Well, why doesn't Mexico attract more MVNOs? I mean, we have, I think it's 0.07 of the market that are MVNOs. It just hasn't been an attractive model in general for Mexico. So it's Virgin Mobile is in Mexico.
Right. So is it because they didn't offer a low enough wholesale price to attract any entry?
Well, they would have to have like new entrants into the country.
Mm-hmm. Just not worth it.
No, especially
there's one
because
though, right?
What
it's
happened?
Called, Mega.
No, there's some. There are a couple. I again have the data, but the other what they were saying is that they thought that when I was, I obviously lost the debate. Here lobbied a lot through the process. One of the arguments was, well, we're also going to be a service to the current carriers,
right?
AT&T and Telefónica and América Móvil, which does not make sense to them because these are their own words. They've already invested in their own spectrum, so they need
networks
and so they need to display using their spectrum. That's their business model, and they're not going to change their business model to become MVNOs. They're just going to compete. Even though the 700, is a good spectrum, they have 1.9. They have others that are just going to compete, and recently acquired also.
Well, so, I mean, so there are, so you're moving to sort of what might the real effects of the network be, setting aside who's paying for it or how it was awarded.
Right.
And so there are a few. One might be investment in new networks with new subscribers, effects of competition, lower prices, and then you might want to think of how it affects anybody's incentives to invest in the future. But are you saying that this has actually caused AT&T and others to invest more in their networks to compete, or that they've ignored Red Compartida completely? And I guess even before that, how much has Red Compartida invested in the network? How much of it is its own network? And how much of it is itself buying wholesale from existing networks?
Okay. This question, I don't have the latest data. I know that the overall investment is supposed to be $7 million. Mil millones, right? That's billion.
Yep.
Yeah. What they've done is that they have invested some of it. I'm not have the data. That I don't have the data, but I should. And they've also rented out América Móvil's towers.
Right. So they're buying wholesale access to a network that they can then resell wholesale.
Exactly.
And claim it as coverage.
Exactly.
Interesting. Yeah. Nice business.
Well, yeah, sad actually. But no, also what has happened is that this is why it's an interesting question that has no straight answer, the second one, because there's two things happening at the same time, and so you cannot isolate
that's the government coming
to get me. The new government is not interested in this anymore. So at the same time, the reform is happening and doing other stuff besides the Red Compartida. And one of the things I think is a good consequence of the reform is that the regulatory agency got more, stronger mandates, more transparency, new people. So it was like refreshed and energized. And one of the huge accomplishments was that during 15 years or more, I actually have a paper on that one, there was just no auctions. So it was, spectrum is scarce, but this was like artificially scarce.
Right.
They just didn't go out there. And when the new regulatory agency, IFT, came in, they just started putting spectrum out there like crazy. And I actually presented that
Right.
So this is going on at the same time.
Right. So
it's hard to know.
So all these other companies are buying spectrum and investing.
AWS 2.5 was auctioned when it had been years since I think it was the 1.7 came out. And plus you have AT&T.
As a new entrant.
As a new entrant.
Or within a few years now.
Right. That's actually presumably not in good shape in Mexico right now. But they bought a lot. Well,
why is that? Why are they having trouble in Mexico?
Well, I think they're having trouble elsewhere. No,
I don't know.
I read they're designing their investments, and they didn't think they bought out several companies when they came in, so they used their money to buy Nextel, to write Usacell, and so that they had a lot of spectrum.
Right, and they had to incorporate several different networks into one.
And it took a while for them to do that. The service was terrible for a while. And then they went into the auction for AWS, and they got it. So right now, AT&T is the one that has more spectrum in the market. So you put that next to the Red Compartida, and it's hard to know what they...
Right, you can't separate out the causes of what.
Right.
So what happens
why they're not getting...
Well, what happens next with Red Compartida?
Well, okay, so then one big thing, one of the things, just as a lesson, I guess, for other countries, because, it didn't happen in Mexico, but that people were, like me, were trying to say, okay, you're going to do this, it's not a good idea, but if you're going to go ahead and do this, at least allow the network to rent out spectrum, not only be wholesale, not only, be an MVNO, but be able to rent capacity to other carriers.
So to lease actual spectrum or
lease
access
capacity.
to its network? So lease access to its network.
Yes.
Right.
Access, of course, because it's their spectrum, but they could access to their network. But the carriers may have been interested in that. They didn't have to become MVNOs, then they would have the capacity to go to the last mile, to the customers with that spectrum. And it would give money to the Red Compartida.
And then I guess the question is whether that would have been net more or less investment than without it. It would be hard to know. But you're saying they didn't do that anyway.
Because it was against the Constitution.
The Constitution prohibited it. Okay.
It also, they could go from 98 to 86.
Right.
Even though it was in the Constitution. So it's just kind of, I don't know.
I mean, and of course it takes stepping back for a second and just noting how weird it is to have such specific rules
in the Constitution, in a law.
Embedded in your, not just the law, in your Constitution.
In the Constitution, but in the law, there was also looking at one of the...
It's like here would be like little kids listening to Schoolhouse Rock and having a song about how to build a telecommunications network instead of We the People.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a good... for, a good example of that is, and you wonder why, because you just really want to not let any, no room for movement. I know the right thing to do, so I'm going to tell you what to do.
Right.
When the law should be just the nature of it is this, and you never know what technology is going to look like. So you better,
even if they had been right in 2013, it wouldn't be right anymore.
In the law, it said, and these are just two examples of how really bizarre this is. The law says that as a human right, in the chapter of human right, Mexicans have the human right to access broadband. I mean, not communicate using technology or, it's like Telegram or it's broadband. As you know, in the asymmetrical regulations, it says in the law, this is not in the Constitution, that interconnection rate is 0.
Right.
Milk should be 7, whatever. So anyway, that's just what's going to happen now. It's anyone's best bet. What happened, what has happened, and looking at it from the bright side, you have a redundant network. Mm-hmm. The Red Compartida has been displayed now in places where there's already other networks.
Right, so it's overbuilding.
It's redundant. Mm-hmm. So it's not in places where there's no service. So in terms of cobertura or digital divides, it's not
It hasn't done anything for
and it will not.
Right. Well, and also in terms of will not, that's also, I think, sort of interesting. You have a new government, and it's a very populist, left populist government. And so you'd think that it would be sort of in favor of this kind of wholesale, not exactly government-owned, but public-private initiative. But it also sounds like it's the kind of government where, like here, Trump doesn't like anything that Obama ever did, just because. And so what's likely to happen now?
That's the first one, of course. But also, I have to say that he's also, the president, saw something that is pretty obvious and trivial, that the Red Compartida is not going to get to the places that it ought to, where there's no service. He sees this is not going to happen. So he is just letting it die for itself, or letting it be. Wither
on the vine.
Right.
So he's actually making I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but a considered decision on Red Compartida.
I mean, it's like the same reason why Trump won, or even it's like there's a good reason to think the Red Compartida was not a good idea in terms of digital divide, of covering people that did not have access. It's not, and he's right. Now, what do you do with that is the problem, So what do you do instead?
Right.
So instead, what he's doing is taking the fiber optic of the Red Troncal that had not been launched.
Which is?
The the fixed broadband network, wholesale network, that model is being discharged. It's not going to happen. It's not going to be launched. It actually tried during the first month. The Undersecretary of Communications, Salma Khalifa, announced the auction, and 2 days later they said, sorry, it's not going to happen.
So wait, what exactly were they auctioning?
The Red Troncal, the second network.
So that's the fixed network.
The fixed network.
And so they were auctioning the right to build it, or the right to use the electric company's fiber optics, or?
Both. This was going to be, just as the Red Compartida, a PPP.
Yeah.
So they wanted to get the private sector to be involved. The government was going to put the fiber optic that has to be illuminated, but it has a extended network throughout the country.
So they announced this was going to happen, and then how many days later did they call it up? 2. So it doesn't. I mean, it's not like they gave anybody a chance to bid. What made them change their mind so quickly?
They told them they weren't going to do it. They got it.
Wait, who's they? Who said that?
The president.
Oh, the president told.
I mean, I'm assuming this.
No, I know. He didn't pick up the phone himself. But no. Also, we know it's not. He probably didn't pick up the phone himself. But
I'm sure he didn't. But
who wanted to do the auction?
The Undersecretary of the Ministry of Communications.
Okay, so that was the Ministry of Communications.
Which was her job.
And it was in the Constitution.
And it was in the Constitution.
Right.
And that was her job. It wasn't the regulatory agency. It was the ministry's
job. So the ministry was doing whether or not it's a good idea, it was doing what it's supposed to do because the Constitution says it. And so then as soon as they started, somebody in the executive office said, you're not going to do this.
Yeah, that's our facts. I mean, the fact is that 2 days after it was announced, it was
2 days after it was canned. Oh, yes. Delayed. They call it a delay. What does the president want to do?
A new network, a different network, and this is not a PPP. Actually, he did come out in the news saying what we need is a real. He didn't even mention Red Compartida, but he said a real network that will get to the people. And he said, who is going to follow me, in the private sector? And silence, And very little after that.
Was it a show to demonstrate that the private sector wouldn't do it? And that give him an excuse to then put public money in it?
I think he would have loved to have somebody put money into it.
He wanted money. Okay.
He wanted money. Because one thing, to understand how this... he has a 6 o'clock every morning show, TV and radio, every morning, including Saturdays. And he talks. So that's his message to the people every morning.
And do people watch this?
I don't know if they have a rating.
I mean, keeping up with Trump's Twitters is bad enough. I couldn't imagine if it was on TV.
So that's how we know all this. So because he communicates these things, and one day,
right. So it's not, none of this is in secret. He says these things.
He says like, okay, so who wants to do this with me? Because really, the past administration didn't do anything. Obviously, everything the past administration's done is just terrible.
And so, I mean, it's always easy for when we study telecom and we think it's interesting even when nobody else does. And so it's really easy to get caught up in it and thinking that everyone else cares. Is it a big deal for him? Or is it just,
yes.
It is. So this is a big deal for him.
Yes. Internet.
Yeah, internet.
Whatever it means. The concept of internet, you know. Social media, I think it's sort of the proxy for internet for him. But it's like, yeah, I know. I understand the internet is very important.
Interesting.
He doesn't say broadband or anything like that. But
he just says internet.
Internet. And I mean, yeah, go to school.
How does he feel about the big tech companies like Facebook and Google? And I mean, there's this big, maybe there's a question of whether it actually exists, but the techlash, right? Where does he stand on that?
He doesn't know.
He doesn't have an opinion on that, as far as he hasn't said anything.
Or as he says, yeah. He doesn't talk about, he doesn't know. He's into 3 or 4 pet projects, and that's what. There's a train he's very fond of. So internet, trains. One train.
One train. One train.
So Maya is going to get from Mexico City to the south.
Should talk to Joe Biden. He's a big train guy too.
Yeah, and the airport.
The airport. Oh, right.
So yeah, that's the current. I think you met the past chief executive officer of the digital strategy. You met her?
I think so.
Remember? Yeah. Well, she was doing stuff.
I'm asking the questions here.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I think I did meet her.
I mean, you could criticize a lot of things that were not done and not enough. But the current guy is totally... He doesn't speak to anybody. We don't know. All I know is that he's in charge of doing this new network that is called Internet for Everyone. Internet para todos. How, when, we don't know.
So right now it's a slogan. It doesn't have plans, or at least public plans, or anything like that yet.
No. We have to look into it.
So more. What do you think will happen?
And everybody is like, we don't, it's like, it's not going to happen. Very unlikely.
And when you say people, do you mean just people who study the...
But the community everybody? Stakeholders. No, because a broader population, I don't think is even aware.
They don't care.
Of what Red Compartida is. Or what this... But he does say he's going to give internet to everybody.
So what do you think will happen over the next couple of years in the sector? And if you were the one giving advice, and you usually are the one giving advice, but if you're the one giving advice and they were listening to you, exactly. what should happen?
Well, there's a lot of sunk costs involved. I have to have another podcast for that. But in terms of what regulation in what the regulatory agency is doing is, I think they should stop designing and implementing regulatory policies that were maybe good 15, 20 years ago, such as unbundling the local loop. Such as, they have 15 different asymmetrical rules, and that is costing a lot of money and it's not working. Much more forward-looking regulation. In terms of the divide of what to do with the networks, it's there. I'm not even thinking constitution. I think that unfortunately, because this is not a good thing for Mexico, but it's probably going to be, it's not going to work. It's going to crash the business model, the Red Compartida. So...
Do you think they'll end up ultimately auctioning the spectrum?
I think they'll end up, I don't think this government, maybe the other government would have rescued it. I don't think this government is going to rescue it. So this government won't rescue it.
But what about now? It's got so many international agencies involved. Do you think, will the bank pour more money into it?
I don't know.
The bank hates to see things that fail.
Oh, maybe they will. And then what's going to happen? It's just going to... Well, you have another network there. It will not fulfill unserved areas.
Mm-hmm. What about upgrades? I mean, we're already talking about everywhere else in the world, 5G. Do they have any plans?
They all talk about plans, but
That's true. Everybody talks about
5G is really tested in how many countries? there's so much to be done with 4 and 3 in Mexico that it's like concentrate on the pending things. And some, América Móvil is doing some tests. And
they're calling Red Compartida, as he calls its network, a 4.5G. I have no idea what that means.
I don't either. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we should probably wrap up on that note. But you also mentioned a few papers, and we'll post those links to those on our website along with the podcast. And then we'll have to have you back soon so we can continue the conversation and know more about what the government is doing, and in addition to all of its other new activities that are relevant. So, Judith, thanks very much.
Thank you.